War and Peace wasn't just Hollywood's most ambitious attempt to compress the greatest novel ever written into a single film. It was a $6 million act of cultural piracy that triggered a Cold War arms race between two superpowers. Produced by a man who had apparently never read the book he was spending a fortune to adapt, directed under conditions of perpetual crisis, and written by at least 8 people, one of whom demanded his name be erased from history before the cameras even stopped rolling. So let's dig into the wreckage of the 1956 War and Peace with 12 secrets the studio tried to bury, including the pair of glasses that drove a producer to screaming rage, the husband nobody wanted, and the way this film accidentally handed the Soviet government the most expensive revenge plot in cinema history. The screenplay of War and Peace did not begin with King Vidor, and it did not begin with any serious attempt to engage with Tolstoy's novel as literature. It began with Dino De Laurentiis dividing Leo Tolstoy's 600,000-word text into sections and handing those sections to a team of Italian screenwriters, giving them 3 weeks to produce something that could be taken to Paramount Pictures as evidence the project was real. What emerged from those 3 weeks was a 506-page document, roughly 5 times the size of a standard screenplay, which if filmed at a minute per page would have produced a film 35 minutes longer than Bondarchuk's 7-hour Soviet epic a decade later. De Laurentiis had this colossus translated from Italian into English, flew to America, and placed it on Paramount's desk. He got his permission to make the movie. The document was never intended to be shot. It was a demonstration object, a proof of ambition rather than a blueprint for production. King Vidor, when he was eventually hired, threw it out entirely. This is exactly the kind of institutional deception that Hollywood's epic production culture of the 1950s both enabled and required, a system in which the appearance of creative readiness was sufficient to unlock funding, regardless of whether the creative readiness was real. What De Laurentiis produced in 3 weeks with a relay team of Italian writers was, functionally, a proposal document disguised as a screenplay, and it worked perfectly. But the real problem was what happened when production began, and it emerged that De Laurentiis' relationship with Tolstoy's novel may have been even more superficial than the 3-week screenplay exercise suggested. Henry Fonda later claimed, and the claim appears in multiple contemporaneous sources, that De Laurentiis had apparently never actually read War and Peace. The evidence Fonda cited was specific and operatic. Pierre Bezukhov, as any reader of Tolstoy knows, wears eyeglasses. The character is large, physically awkward, bespectacled, philosophically restless, and conspicuously unsuited to conventional heroism, which is precisely what makes him the moral center of the novel, a man navigating catastrophic historical events through intellect rather than military grace. De Laurentiis insisted that Pierre be played as a conventional romantic, heroic lead, and he insisted, with particular fury, that Pierre not wear eyeglasses. According to Fonda, De Laurentiis would go into fits of screaming rage whenever he saw him wearing glasses on set, arguing that glasses were not properly heroic and did not suit the character as he understood it. The conclusion that both Fonda and King Vidor drew from these episodes, as Fonda later stated, was that De Laurentiis had never read the novel and didn't know that eyeglasses were one of Pierre's defining characteristics in the source text. Fonda's solution was to wear his glasses only on the days when De Laurentiis was not present on set, maintaining the character's visual authenticity when the producer wasn't watching and reverting to his unglassed heroic face when he was. He was managing a producer's ignorance by scheduling around it. The screenplay that emerged from this chaos carries 6 credited writers, which was already a number that reviewers found remarkable and somewhat troubling as a signal of creative disorder. The credited names are Bridget Boland, Robert Westerby, King Vidor, Mario Camerini, Ennio De Concini, and Ivo Perilli. That's 6 human beings attached in various capacities to the act of turning Tolstoy into a film. But the real story of the screenplay is the 7th name, the one that isn't there. According to contemporaneous sources, including trades reporting at the time of release, Irwin Shaw wrote the final shooting script for the film. Shaw was a serious literary figure, a novelist and playwright with a reputation for intelligent, serious work, not a Hollywood journeyman comfortable with anonymous contributions to studio productions. He wrote what was intended to be the document the film was actually made from. He then demanded that his name be completely removed from the credits. The reason, as reported at the time, was that King Vidor had admitted that his wife, Elizabeth Hill, had rewritten much of Shaw's dialogue. Shaw's response to discovering that the script he had written had been substantially altered by the director's wife without Shaw's input or consent was to request that no trace of his work appear on screen. His name is absent from every print of the film. The man who arguably wrote the closest thing to a final shooting script, that War and Peace had contributed nothing to its official record. And then there were the further uncredited contributors: Jean Orange, Pierre Bost, Sergio Amidei, Gian Gaspare Napolitano, and second unit director Mario Soldati, all of whom apparently added material to a document that was being rewritten during production itself, as Vito revised scenes the night before they were scheduled to shoot. Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, the brooding, emotionally armored military hero whose arc forms the film's second great dramatic line alongside Pierre's, was not cast on any basis related to the character's literary or dramatic requirements. He was cast because Audrey Hepburn, who had been signed to play Natasha for a record fee of $350,000, could not bear to leave her recently acquired husband behind for a production that was going to keep her in Italy for months. The husband was Mel Ferrer. The solution was to create a role for him. This is documented without ambiguity. TCM's own historical record of the production notes that the newly married actress could not bear to leave her husband Mel Ferrer behind for such a long shoot, so Ferrer was brought in to play war hero Prince Andrei. War and Peace opened with a casting requirement, and it was met by spousal accommodation rather than by any assessment of Ferrer's suitability for one of Russian literature's most complex male characters. This was the only occasion Hepburn and Ferrer would co-star on screen together. The marriage itself lasted until 1968, when they divorced. Ferrer was widely described by contemporaries as controlling, referred to in some circles as her Svengali, a characterization Hepburn herself publicly rejected. William Holden, who knew both of them, offered the diplomatically evasive observation that he thought, "Audrey allows Mel to think he influences her. What is unambiguous is that Andrei Bolkonsky in the 1956 War and Peace is there because Audrey Hepburn would not go to Italy alone." Before Fonda arrived as Pierre, the role passed through a remarkable sequence of rejections. King Vidor's own preferences were Paul Scofield or Peter Ustinov, both sophisticated, intellectually versatile British actors who could have brought the character's philosophical awkwardness and European sensibility. De Laurentiis rejected both, stating that neither was marketable enough for a production of this scale and expense. Gregory Peck was considered, so were Stuart Granger and Richard Burton. Montgomery Clift was offered the role and turned it down over a pay dispute. But the strangest rejection in the file belongs to Marlon Brando. Brando, who at that point was perhaps the most commercially potent and critically respected actor in American cinema, declined the role specifically because, according to sources compiled in the production record, he disliked Audrey Hepburn. Not the project, not the character, not the script or the director or the producer, the person. He would not make a film with Audrey Hepburn. The exact nature of whatever personal antagonism or professional disagreement produced this position is not detailed in the available record, but the fact sits there. One of the great casting opportunities in Hollywood history, Brando as Pierre, was declined because of a personal aversion to the co-star. The role went to Henry Fonda, who was 50 years old, playing a character 20 to 30 years his junior, and who would later state publicly that he only took it for the money. The $350,000 fee that secured Audrey Hepburn as Natasha was, at the time, more than any actress had ever been paid per film. It was a figure that De Laurentiis and Carlo Ponti agreed to because Hepburn was the production's single most essential commercial asset. Without her, the film could not be made at the scale and with the prestige that justified its cost, but the fee came with structural consequences that permanently shaped the film's distribution. Because Hepburn was under contract simultaneously to Paramount Pictures in the US and Associated British Picture Corporation in the UK, the two companies were given the respective American and British distribution rights to the finished film in exchange for permitting her to participate. Her services were not simply purchased. They were traded in a deal that meant the production surrendered control of its two most commercially significant markets as the price of casting its lead actress. The further consequence was creative. Hepburn's contract gave her a meaningful degree of production influence. She used this to hire her personal costume fitter, Hubert de Givenchy, and her preferred makeup artist, Grazia De Rossi. She also used it to bring Mel Ferrer in as Andrei. The woman being paid a record fee was simultaneously deploying that leverage to shape the casting around her personal life. Whether this constitutes creative control or personal accommodation depends on one's willingness to separate the two, which the production record makes difficult. The exteriors of War and Peace, the sweeping Russian countryside, the snowy Napoleonic retreats, the fields of Borodino and Austerlitz were filmed primarily in Italy at Cinecittà and the Ponti de Laurentiis studios in Rome for interiors, and at locations in Turin, Pinerolo, and Piedmont for the outdoor sequences. Sardinia was used for specific battlefield material. Snow sequences that were planned for Finland and Yugoslavia were eventually abandoned as unnecessary, with footage shot in Finland repurposed as process shots. The film's entire geographical premise, Russia, 1805 to 1812, was constructed entirely within a country that is climatically, architecturally, and topographically nothing like its subject. Italy stood in for Russia because it was cheaper, more logistically accessible, and because the Italian production infrastructure at Cinecittà was at that point the most capable in the world for large-scale epic filmmaking. The cold that the film depicts, the brutal Russian winter that destroyed Napoleon's army, the frost that Tolstoy rendered as a physical character in the novel's third act was cinematographic illusion. Costumes, breath effects, and Piedmontese hillsides dressed to approximate the Russian steppe. When Henry Fonda stumbles through Moscow's burned ruins, he is walking through an Italian studio's reconstruction of a city he has never visited in a country the production never entered. This is not unusual for the epic film genre of the 1950s, but it has a specific irony in the context of war and peace, whose geographical authenticity, whose rootedness in the specific physical landscape of Russia is one of the novel's defining qualities. For the battle sequences, which were primarily directed not by King Vidor, but by second unit director Mario Soldati, the production used approximately 18,000 Italian military personnel as extras. This figure is remarkable in its own right, but the specific controversy it generated is more revealing. The use of active Italian military personnel as paid film extras caused controversy in Italian parliamentary circles. Politicians objected to the Italian army being deployed not in service of national defense or public duties, but in service of a Hollywood Italian commercial production. The debate was, at its core, about whether the military was an instrument of the state or a resource that could be rented out to private entertainment concerns, and the fact that the production had apparently secured this arrangement, thousands of uniformed soldiers available for large-scale battle choreography, revealed the particular confluence of political and commercial relationships that allowed Dino De Laurentiis to operate on the scale he did. 65 physicians, dressed as soldiers and scattered throughout the location shoots, attended the battle sequences to provide immediate medical care to any extras or stuntmen who were injured during filming. That number, 65 doctors concealed within the extras, suggests the production's own internal assessment of how dangerous the battle sequences were likely to be. The Irwin Shaw situation deserves its own examination as a story about authorship, credit, and the specific humiliation of the Hollywood writing hierarchy. Shaw was a writer of genuine literary standing. His novel, The Young Lions, had been published in 1948 to considerable critical and commercial success, and his credentials as a serious literary figure were not in question. He wrote the final shooting script for War and Peace in the framework of a significant production, for a substantial fee with full professional investment in the work. He then discovered that King Vidor had admitted, apparently without particular embarrassment, that his wife, Elizabeth Hill, had rewritten much of Shaw's dialogue during Vidor's own nocturnal rewrites. The mechanics of this are worth dwelling on. Shaw's dialogue, the specific words that characters in his screenplay spoke, had been altered not by a credited collaborator, not by the producer, not by a studio executive, but by the director's wife, whose contribution to the film was not subject to any formal credit or professional oversight. Shaw's response was not to negotiate, not to seek an arbitration or a credit restoration. He simply demanded total erasure, that every trace of his name be removed from every printed credit in every format in which the film would be distributed. The studio complied. Irwin Shaw's War and Peace screenplay, which was apparently the document most directly responsible for the film that audiences saw, does not appear anywhere in the official record of War and Peace. The eyeglasses confrontation between Fonda and De Laurentiis operates as a comic subplot running beneath the serious production tensions, but it reveals something genuinely dark about the power dynamics on a large-scale Italian-American co-production of this era. Fonda had agreed to a role that required him to play a character decades younger than himself, in a language register foreign to his entire screen identity, for a script that was being rewritten under him while he worked. He had arrived at this commitment because he had read an Irwin Shaw screenplay that no longer existed by the time cameras rolled, and now he was being screamed at by a producer who, both Fonda and Vidor believed, had not read the source novel, for wearing the glasses that the source novel specifically assigns to his character. The solution Fonda found, wearing the glasses whenever De Laurentiis was absent, removing them when the producer was present, is both pragmatic and slightly absurd. It means the film contains performances of Pierre given in two different physical registers depending on whether the producer was on set that day. The eyeglasses appear in some scenes and not others for reasons that have nothing to do with dramatic consistency or character logic and everything to do with scheduling around one man's screaming rages. Pierre Bezukhov's face in the 1956 War and Peace is determined by the calendar of a producer who may never have known why he objected to the glasses in the first place. When the 1956 War and Peace was released in the Soviet Union in 1959, 3 years after its Italian and American premieres, it caused a reaction whose scale and consequences nobody in De Laurentiis's production had remotely anticipated. The film was a significant hit with Soviet audiences. This was humiliating to Soviet cultural officials in a very specific and pointed way. The most celebrated, most beloved, most nationally symbolic novel in Russian literature had been turned into a successful Hollywood spectacle by a capitalist Italian-American co-production. Soviet artists wrote angry letters to cultural authorities demanding that the Americans not be allowed to have the last word on Leo Tolstoy. The Soviet government agreed. The state commission that followed resulted in Sergei Bondarchuk being given the full resources of the Soviet film industry, the Soviet military, and the Soviet government's virtually unlimited cultural budget to produce a definitive Russian war and peace. Film historian Denise Youngblood has estimated that the total cost of Bondarchuk's production, accounting for the authentic 19th century artifacts loaned by 40 museums across the USSR, the Red Army soldiers deployed as extras in their hundreds of thousands, and the state subsidies that made the entire enterprise possible came to something approaching $700 million in contemporary dollars. What the Kremlin built in response to a Hollywood film was one of the most expensive productions in the history of cinema. The 7-hour result won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film in 1968. Bondarchuk suffered a heart attack during the production. During the Battle of Borodino sequence, he was clinically dead for several minutes. King Vidor's rushed, chaotic, overwritten, undercast, proxy Russia production of Tolstoy's novel did not merely fail to be definitive, it directly caused a geopolitical cultural mobilization of unprecedented scale, and generated a masterpiece in response to its own inadequacy. When War and Peace opened in August 1956, Time magazine noted the inevitable telescoping and hopscotching that the adaptation's compression required, while managing to praise Hepburn and offer the grudging concession that Fonda builds beautifully into his part. Variety was carefully respectful. The film received Academy Award nominations for Best Director, Best Cinematography in Color, and Best Costume Design. It won the Golden Globe for Best Foreign Language Film, which was perhaps the most technically accurate category available given that it was an Italian production with an American director and a cast of at least 5 nationalities speaking dialogue that had been written, rewritten again, and partially erased. It earned approximately $6.25 million in American and Canadian box office rentals by January 1957. A respectable return, though not the overwhelming commercial triumph that would have justified its chaos. What the algorithm of history has done to this film is something neither its admirers nor its detractors fully predicted. It has become a document of its own impossibility, a film that is studied less for what it achieved than for what it reveals about the conditions under which it was made, about the collision between commercial ambition and literary seriousness, about the specific insanities of the Hollywood Cinecittà production culture of the mid-1950s that produced genuinely beautiful cinematography from Jack Cardiff and a score from Nino Rota of real grace alongside eyeglasses, worn only when the producer wasn't watching. It has also become, involuntarily, the origin story of the greatest war epic in cinema history, the film that told the Soviet Union it had a problem that needed solving, and that produced Bondarchuk's masterpiece as its solution. So let me leave you with the question the production itself was incapable of asking directly. A film about the collision between individual human lives and historical forces too large for any one person to comprehend was produced through a collision of individual human failures, a producer who hadn't read the source, a writer erased from his own work, a star whose husband arrived uninvited, an actor wearing glasses on alternate days, all of which combined to accidentally set in motion one of the most extraordinary creative acts of the 20th century. Does that make the 1956 War and Peace a film that succeeded by failing? That earned its place in history by demonstrating what it could not do? Or is there something genuinely dark about a cultural machine that turns human chaos, institutional dishonesty, and one man screaming ignorance about eyeglasses into a catalyst for a 7-hour Cold War masterpiece that nearly killed its director?